the digestive system. Eat the food, liquefy the food, suck all the good stuff out of the food, get rid of everything else. That's kind of a summation of it. This slide in front of you is the digestive system. You can look at it as having two parts. One is called the gastrointestinal tract, or the GI tract. The other is accessory organs. So I'm going to trace the GI tract here with the mouse. So mouth, pharynx, remember that from respiratory. Esophagus. Esophagus is like the hallway. Then stomach. Stomach is going to liquefy the food. Then the food goes into the small intestine. That's all this stuff here. The small intestine is where absorption is going to happen. Large intestine is where the water is going to be. This is where water reclamation happens. You want to get the water back. Then rectum, anus, out. So that's the gastrointestinal tract. That is one continuous tube. So the mouth, the esophagus, the intestines here, stomach, it's one continuous tube from the mouth to the anus. And of course it looks different, right? The stomach looks quite different from the large intestine, which looks different from the small intestine, but it's still one tube, just stretched out here and there, right? There are some differences to it, but it's still the same tube. So that continuous tube is called the GI tract. There are accessory organs. There's 6. 3 are up in the head. The other 3 are down in the abdomen. The 3 in the head, which I'm not going to really spend any time on, are the mouth, not the mouth, the teeth, the tongue, and the salivary glands. And then down here, there's 3 accessory organs. The liver, there's the liver, the pancreas, which is behind the stomach, and the gallbladder, that little green thing right there. It's kind of behind the liver. Those 3 things, liver, pancreas, gallbladder, those are going to aid in digestion. They are, however, not part of the GI tract, but they all secrete things. They go through like a duct into the small intestine. So you'll see that. So let's look at the GI tract, at the layers of the GI tract. 4. First layer is called mucosa. No surprise there. The lining, mucosa, submucosa underneath the mucosa, muscularis, and serosa. So let's start in and go out, right? So the mucosa, so the whole GI tract has these 4 layers. So this could very well be your esophagus. Actually looks like an esophagus. It could be, the stomach has these same 4 layers. The large intestine has these same 4 layers. Okay, so very beginning, the lining. It's always going to be epithelial tissue, right? So it's epithelial tissue, and then right underneath the layer of epithelium, you have a layer of connective tissue called lamina propria. And you notice inside, like the green things, that is lymphatic tissue. And then there's some ducts from the mucus glands going into the epithelium. And then there's a small layer of muscle called the muscularis mucosae. And that's going to, see, not everything in your body is flat. Like this is looking kind of flat right here. So your esophagus would be rather smooth, like the lining, right? But the small intestine, for example, have all these like finger-like projections. They look like a bunch of little fingers, right? And so the muscularis mucosae helps to make different shapes, right? Your stomach has a certain shape to it, and your small intestine has a certain shape to it. So that's it. Now we're to submucosa. Submucosa is just another type of connective tissue, and you see by the yellow here that it's innervated with nerves. All the nerves for the digestive system is called the ENS, enteric. See if we have the words somewhere here. It's the enteric nervous system right here. So I'm kind of underlining it. ENTERIC. Right, so that's the enteric nervous system. That's the nervous system that supplies the digestive system, the GI tract. So you see here in the submucosa, you have mucus glands. And then you have nerves that are activating those mucus glands. So that's it for submucosa. I mean, there's blood, there's glands, and there's nervous tissue. Muscularis. So let's look at the muscularis. Here, we are looking at 2 layers of smooth muscle, circular, longitudinal. For the most part, that is lining the GI tract. So that's going to be responsible for something called peristalsis, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. That is a way to get food moving through the GI tract. So these layers of smooth muscle, they alternate in their contractions. Right, so when food's in your stomach, for example, and you feel your stomach growl, that's what you're feeling. You're feeling the smooth muscle of the muscularis alternating in their contractions. Finally, you have this outer layer, another layer of connective tissue, which is what we say when we don't feel like explaining what a layer is. So it's just connective tissue. Here it's called the serosa, but remember, if it's attached to something, like the trachea, in the case of the esophagus, then we call it adventitia. So serosa or adventitia. So it's unlikely I'm going to ask you anything about that outer layer. So those are the 4 layers. They do look different. I mean, there's subtle differences especially to the mucosa, depending on what organ it is. So let's talk about the nerve supply. And let me jump back to this slide. Right? So you have two things that nerves are hooked into. One is the mucus glands to secrete mucus and some other things. The other thing is to the muscle. So a network of nerves is called a plexus. So you see down here we have two different plexuses, submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus. Submucosal plexus is in the submucosa. That's to secrete mucus. Myenteric plexus is in the it's MY tells you it's muscle, right? So that's innervation to the smooth muscle of the muscularis. I'm making a video.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, shut up.
Oh, you're making a video. Oh, is it online?
Yeah. Dude, I'm not redoing it.
Oh, wait, you're not redoing it?
So this slide shows you the 2 parts of the enteric nervous system, the myenteric and submucosal plexus. All right, so the myenteric, that is the 2 layers of smooth muscle that's going to let food move through the GI tract. And then the submucosal plexus controls secretions. I put down here that I have, again, the vagus nerve. Remember, that's the only cranial nerve that continues past the neck, lower neck area, right? And then more importantly, parasympathetic. So remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest. So just like in the heart is covered with pericardium, and the lungs is covered with a pleural membrane. Your abdominal organs are covered with peritoneum. So this is kind of a side view or a sagittal view. I'm going to go to another slide and show you a different view. And there's 5 different types of peritoneum. And we're looking at a couple here. The first is this apron. So you notice here, this is like the large intestine up here. There, you can't really see the small intestine. because it's covered by this peritoneum called the greater omentum. So when you look at it like a cadaveric specimen and you first make an incision down the abdomen, you're not going to see, this is what you're going to see. This is what gives the belly fat. You know, there's like commercials that tell you all these different things. It's peritoneum, because the peritoneum has a lot of adipose tissue. So it's just an apron that covers all of this area. You can also see the falciform ligament. That is another peritoneum. So look, here's the diaphragm. Here's the liver. And it looks like the falciform ligament is splitting the liver in half. The liver is not like that. The liver is like a bunch of lobes, actually. So the liver is not really like one liver or even two. It's just a bunch of lobes. And the falciform ligament is holding the liver to the diaphragm. So we have two different peritoneums on this slide. So here's the falciform ligament. Underneath the liver, you have the lesser omentum, and that's suspending the stomach to the liver. And then the liver, in turn, is being held to the diaphragm by the falciform ligament, right? So, you know, if you were to cut someone open, their guts aren't just going to fall out like that. And then there's two more. The mesentery. So the small intestine doesn't just unravel; it's held to itself by mesentery. And if you look at the mesentery, like if you were to take out some of the small intestine and kind of like pull it apart a little bit, you see there's like webbing in between, like it's kind of showing here, right? And it has a lot of blood supply and nerve supply. And then mesocolon is holding this large intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. So I've got it all summarized here. So peritonitis is a common, not common, but you know, you would definitely run across it in the medical field pretty quickly, right? You'll run across pericarditis, pleuritis, and peritonitis, and it's very easy because you can just take your pinky and just touch their abdomen, and they're going to scream in pain. So, you know, they have peritonitis. All right, so let's talk about swallowing, and I believe swallowing will be the last thing I want to talk about. Swallowing is called deglutition, so that's the act of swallowing. So you chew the food, you mix the saliva with the food, and your saliva has some enzymes in it and some other things in it. But when you chew that food up, it's called a bolus. Remember, bolus is like a mass of something. So in this case, it's just a mass of chewed up food. We call that a bolus. So it's going back by your soft palate. There's receptors in your soft palate or back in your oropharynx. There are receptors, and they're going to send a signal to the brainstem. And then the returning impulse does two things. One, which we've already talked about. One, the uvula, which is going to block the nasal passages. And two, the epiglottis, which is going, remember, that's like the cartilage of the larynx. That's going to block access to the trachea. So the food has no choice but to go down the esophagus. So once it's in the esophagus, then the other thing you're going to have is the esophageal stage, and then you have peristalsis. And peristalsis is just alternating contractions of the muscularis. So if we go back here and look at the muscularis, you find a circular layer. So in the case of the esophagus, it's circling around the esophagus, and then you have a longitudinal layer going up and down the esophagus. So there's two layers of smooth muscle, and they alternate in their contractions. So that's the peristalsis, right? And so that you're going to move the food down the esophagus, and ultimately there's going to be, and that's what this is showing, right? So here the uvula has been pushed back up here, so the food cannot go up here and up into your nasal passages. And then you see the epiglottis right now is not protecting the trachea, but here it's closed over the trachea, so the food has to move down the esophagus. So the sphincter. A sphincter is like a ring of muscle, and it'll like open up and then close. It's like your anal sphincter, right? But you have it through your GI tract. You have it in a few different places. One place is here, between, or like right where at the very end of the esophagus and into the stomach. Here, this slide is calling it the lower esophageal sphincter. A more suitable word would be called the cardiac sphincter. And that's really, I mean, I'm going to get to that in the next lecture, but that's because this region of the stomach right here is called the cardia. So, but anyway, it's called the cardiac sphincter. And what happens is that it opens up, it lets the food pass into the stomach, and then it closes again. So the stomach is acidic. You don't want the acid going into the esophagus. So that's what that lower esophageal sphincter or cardiac sphincter is for. So the esophageal stage of deglutition is peristalsis of the smooth muscle until the food passes the cardiac sphincter and goes into the stomach. So that's kind of a quick introduction, and it's taking you very briefly, because we didn't even talk about like teeth or any salivary glands or anything like that. But it's the food, it's following it all the way until the food gets into the stomach. And so then the next lecture I'll start with the stomach.